Thank you very much, and it's really nice to see so many people here today. I've been asked to say a few words about the document that you have before you, and specifically the first section on ethics in public life. For anyone in Malta who cares about ethics in public life, the last 7 years, and especially the last 3, and even more especially the last 2 months, have been depressing and bleak in the extreme. There have, however, been some things to take heart from. Silver linings that allow you to hope that one day we can get to a better place, even though there isn't much evidence to go on at the moment. Firstly, the rise of civil non-partisan activism. I salute Repubblica and other groups like them for all that they have done, who rolled up their sleeves and fought for what was right against the current, while others like me were just at home feeling depressed. Their example shows that we must fight hard to get back what we lost. Civil society must never again allow itself to be led by the nose by political parties. It's found its voice and it must never lose it again. The other positive that I cling on to is the fact that even as our politicians failed us, even as our institutions failed us, and they did fail us, our executive, led by a gang that was motivated by self-enrichment, our parliament and our opposition completely unable to hold them to account, our judiciary compromised, under-resourced, stumbling around from one unsatisfactory magisterial inquiry to another. But even as all of these failed us, once people saw that their politicians, their institutions weren't going to stand up for us, they stood up for themselves. Not all the people by any means, but enough of them to force a prime minister who a few weeks ago seemed unassailable to resign in disgrace. And make no mistake, despite yesterday's shows, he is resigning in disgrace, and he will go down in history as having resigned in disgrace. So, by going out onto the streets, and I loved that presentation that you showed us, by going out on the streets, we have saved our democracy for now, just about. But it remains in danger, and we need to find a more sustainable model to sustain it, to keep it going, without us having to go out onto the streets. In part, by strengthening our institutions, by setting a high ethical standard that must be met by all those in positions of responsibility, by increasing scrutiny of those people, and transparency to help ensure that the standards are met, and by educating citizens, especially young citizens, to demand more at all times of their elected officials. One of the most depressing things that you hear in these times is that this is simply the way that things work in Malta, that we have simply reverted to some inbuilt, ingrained, low standard that is endemic to Malta and the Maltese, that this is how it has always been and that's how it will always will be. And every one of us in this room has to fight this tooth and nail, because if it is left unchallenged, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's not true. One of the most damaging, pernicious things that this gang has done is to have dragged our standards down and to make what a few years ago was unthinkable, unacceptable, suddenly it defeats us. It's become the norm. Just a few years ago, we were not great by any means, but in many ways in these things, we were already a lot better than we are now. In a previous life, I had the privilege of heading Foreign Affairs Minister Joe Borges' private team, his secretariat. We took for granted so many checks and balances that we had to work with and that we accepted as a normal part of public life and public service. And they all seem to have been swept away. Things like permanent secretaries who are not ministers' lapdogs but are there as guardians of the civil service. strict limits on the members in ministers' teams, security checks done on them to make sure that they're the right people, very strict limits on how many of them could actually come from outside the civil service, clear guidelines on gifts, the assumption that everyone was putting the public interest first, and the higher standard of scrutiny. I had a member of staff once who came to tell me that they were being investigated by the police. I told them that I hope they would clear their name, that they would have my personal support, but that it was obvious that their contract was terminated with immediate effect. And this was understood as the only possible way of acting at this time. Nobody was going to say, you have to wait until there's a court decision or even a court case. Anyway, I am not naive. I have no doubt that at the time, around me, there were people who did not follow these precepts and who did not meet the standards. The big difference is that if they were doing it, they were the exception. They were swimming against the tide and having to hide it. They knew that if they were ever caught, they would be out, and that the country's institutions would seek to hold them to account. And most importantly, while these rogues no doubt existed, they were not the point of government. Government was broadly seeking to do the right thing, to transform the economy, to carry out the reforms necessary to get into Europe, to compete, to create a modern economy. Today, the current government has been built about creating massive projects for personal gain and for putting the rest of the economy on steroids to make sure that the wealth is shared and opposition is kept quiet. I don't say this in any way to praise a previous government. On the contrary, this is what I expect as a minimum from those in public service. And I would hope that when we finally get a decent government again, wherever it comes from, and whenever it is, we can do much better. And that's what this document sets out to do with regard to ethics in public life. To set an ethics, a standard for public life that chimes with the innate sense of fairness and justice that brings us out onto the streets when we see it is being flouted. To build things on such a transparent basis that anyone in public service who does not meet the standard sticks out like a sore thumb and will either resign or be forced to resign. To once again ensure that it is clear, both to politicians and to citizens, that politicians are there to serve the people rather than to enrich themselves, and that they and their teams should be held to a much higher standard than everybody else. May I congratulate Republica for demanding this higher standard and for putting itself forward as part of a newly awakened civil society that will work to ensure that the higher standard is adhered to. When it comes to ethics in public life, we are at a low point at the moment. But we're there because bad people have dragged us down. The good side of that is that good people, the good people in this room, can drag us back up again. But you have to remember that those bad people had a plan and they were very, very organized. This is the beginning of giving ourselves a plan and getting organized ourselves. Thank you very much.